Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing today? A little Friday energy there. My name is Jordan Likeness, and I'm the Canada Program Manager for the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. And so that's a lot of words, some of which are German. But those of you are unfamiliar with our work, we're the oldest political foundation in Germany, and we work in over 100 countries around the world with a pretty unique and important mandate, and that's to promote equity, freedom, social justice, and social democracy. And so I'm very pleased to be here today to introduce some new research that we co-authored with the Broadbent Institute. So this report is called Shifting Borders, Canadian Attitudes Towards Immigration. And we partnered for this project because we wanted to better understand how Canadians are thinking and feeling about immigration at a moment when we're seeing some long-standing consensuses about immigration in our country shift. So we know that when housing and healthcare concerns rise, right-wing populists are always looking to exploit the issue and exploit that frustration. And it's more important than ever in these circumstances, especially for those of us who believe that government is a force for good, to understand the nuances behind these changing views, what's driving them, so that we can make a case for a just and inclusive immigration system. So I want to really thank our partners at Viewpoints Research for conducting the survey and the work that underpins this report. They were great to work with, and the insights from James Valke and Natalie Pila are incredibly valuable. So you're going to see that despite some troubling trends, this research reveals some clear opportunities for progressives to lead with smart policy, strong values, and a clear vision for how immigration can build a better future for everybody here in Canada. So thank you very much, and without further ado, I'm going to welcome James and Natalie to the stage to get into the numbers. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Not only am I the Director of Research and Strategy at Viewpoints, I'm also the President and Founder of the Jordan Likeness Fan Club. Every morning I get to see her brilliance, her intelligence, and her patience on Cursive Politics. She's really great. Let's give a hand to Jordan for all the work she does. Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate this. Viewpoints conducted some research of residents of Canada to explore perceptions on immigration, what messaging works to strengthen public support, and what we can expect from other sides. Canadians have celebrated building a diverse, multicultural society with decades of open immigration policy and multicultural policy that have shaped the country we have today. We wanted to unpack perceptions around how much immigrants are being scapegoated or blamed for current domestic problems. We've seen other public opinion research touch on the topic of immigration, but none that really dug into the nuances of the wide range and different types.
So what we did in partnership with Broadbent and Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, we ran a national online survey just a couple weeks ago in early March and got around 1,000 responses, weighted them by age, gender, and region to ensure representativeness, and an equivalent random sample for those research folks in the audience is plus or minus 3%. Our first big question in this survey was, generally, what kind of impact do you think immigration has had on Canada? And what we found is that opinion is divided, but skews positive. So nearly half, about 45%, are saying they think that the impact is very good or somewhat good. About a quarter feel neutral, and around 30% think that it has a negative impact. So this suggests a fairly positive view around immigration generally.
And when I talk about previous public opinion polling, these are the kind of questions they ask and then they move on to something else. As we go through the presentation, that wide perspective will narrow down and focus on some of the more specifics and some arguments on that front as well, too.
So we found that something is shifting. One of the other questions that we asked in the survey is, in the past year, has your opinion on immigration changed? Half say that it has changed, and half say it stayed the same. A third are saying that, yes, I think it has changed, and I think we should allow less immigration. So this gives us the sense that we see a shift, but we're not looking at a complete shift of opinion, right? Half are saying it stayed the same for them. The sentiment still suggests skewing positive, but things are shifting.
Throughout the survey, we tested arguments around immigration. Specifically, we focused on the topics of housing, public services, and economics are intermingled throughout there as well. When we look at housing, and this slide shows you some of the arguments we tested to get people's perceptions of the agree, strongly disagree. When we look at housing, we tested each argument with participants in a random order, not in the order you see. Here we begin to see some contradictions of opinions. On the bottom bar, we see 70% feel that immigration makes housing harder to find and more expensive.
But at the same time, if you look at the bar right above that, you see an argument we tested that says that Canada needs more doctors, home building professionals, and nurses. We need the country to welcome as many immigrants from those professions as possible. And around the same percentage are agreeing with that statement, agreeing that skilled folks are needed to fix economic problems in housing. People are supportive of immigrants needed for that work.
And while the contradictions may seem odd, to our mind, and what research has shown us, is that it reflects a bigger concern about housing in general.
We also see a similar issue with public service strain, where people are both responding to the survey and sharing their opinions in ways that suggest they see immigration as both the problem and the solution. In that bottom bar, we see 63% feel that immigration adds to public service strain. But again, pointing to that argument above it, a similar amount recognize that skilled professional immigrants are needed for keeping healthcare and other social services sustainable. And above that, you see, again, similar percentages agreeing with arguments around immigration supporting economic growth, and that immigrants and refugees are being unfairly scapegoated.
Now, on the question of economic sustainability, we see contradictions once again. The top two bars, over half think immigration supports economic growth and that the temporary foreign worker program has been exploited. These seem as though they're contradictions in your mind, but this is what the data shows us.
Yeah, at the same time, again, that bottom argument, a similar amount are also thinking that immigration pushes wages lower, creates more competition for jobs. So we keep seeing this come up in all of these different areas that we talked about in our survey, where people are pointing to immigration as the problem, but also the solution.
Yeah, so you're thinking, okay, James and Natalie, what are we going to do with these contradictions? How do you account for these mixed results? And I would say that's a brilliant question. And that's why we explored people's perceptions of different types of immigration. That's where we can see some of these nuances peel out. Now, before we dive too deep into this, it must be said that, you know, as our Taylor Award winner mentioned, the immigration system has changed a lot over the last years, especially over the last 2 decades. It is not what it looked like in the 1970s and certainly not what it looked like in the 1980s. And I expect our panel, who will be speaking after us, will dig into some of those, some of that perception as well too. But we wanted to explore perceptions of different types of immigrations today, and that's what this question achieves.
Yeah, so we had asked people if the government were to have to prioritize different types of immigration, how should they prioritize it? And by far, people put highest priority, they're most interested in immigration when it involves workers with specialized skills in high demand fields. So if you're looking at that top bar, you see that by a large margin, the highest priority being on folks with skills in high demand fields like healthcare, engineering, and technology. And at the bottom, you see the least prioritized, mentioning temporary foreign workers, investors and entrepreneurs, and international students, so more temporary forms of immigration. So to us, this suggests that people are not looking for an end to immigration, but a desire or a focus for the system to fulfill economic objectives, to support the development of a strong and prosperous economy. And these findings, to us, complicate the narrative that we've started to hear that Canada is becoming less welcoming to immigrants. What it suggests to us is that folks are feeling economic pressures across the board, and the appetite right now is for reform, not restriction. People still see immigration as a valuable part, a strong and valuable part of Canada's society.
And it also explains, if you cast your mind back to January 2024, when the federal government made a big announcement to cut student visas by 35%. That's kind of a large announcement, and there was almost no pushback from the political parties. There was no pushback from the Canadian public. So reform is in the offing, and they took, that sentiment for reform is out there, and there are steps being taken to address that seem to gather consensus.
But of course, like with every survey, these results are a snapshot. What we found, though, echoes things that we've heard from folks in focus groups over the last couple of months. People are so focused on housing affordability, healthcare system quality, and above all, cost of living. It's what we hear all the time.
Yeah, and when I can tell you anecdotally, over the last 18 months in focus groups, whenever people have brought up the issue of immigration, it has never been immigration is bad, we need to stop it. The sentence goes, there's something wrong with your immigration system because we're having such housing crisis, because we're having such public service crisis. There is a mindset of scarcity. Again, it's never we need to stop immigration. It's almost never we need to stop immigration. It's about shifting the way things are prioritized right now.
So I think we have a little bit more time. We regularly wouldn't add some crosstab analysis in our presentation, but since we have a bit of time, we thought we should share some findings that would be of interest to folks in the audience. We've got a few significant differences between groups with certain characteristics. So we're looking at, on the left side, you'll see folks who are currently members of labor unions. That was one of the questions we asked. And as well, how familiar people are with the immigration process. So these are not the only ones that we found interesting. You can definitely find more details and more findings from this research, a more fulsome overview on the Broadbent website, but this just gives you a little bit of a taste of some of the differences that we found. And again, for research folks in the audience, the smallest of these groups, which was 250 respondents, the margin of error on that is plus or minus 6%.
19 times out of 20.
19 times out of 20. So the first one we're going to show you, we looked at the perceptions of immigration, so that big general question we talked about up front, and looked at that by those who are union members and who are not, and then the other question about people's familiarity with immigration. And we found that union members and those who are more familiar have positive perceptions of immigration to a greater extent than their counterparts. So union members, more positive perceptions, and same for those as people become more familiar with the immigration process, they're more likely to have positive perceptions of immigration generally.
Yeah, I'm going to linger on this slide a little bit. Those very good perceptions at 25% on the top and 34% on the bottom are really people that connect with this issue and feel very strongly. We ask these questions somewhat good or very good, and the very goods indicate a strong affinity towards this.
The other one we'll briefly show you is that we looked at some of these more positive arguments around immigration. So immigration grows the workforce, keeps our social programs sustainable, and immigration supports economic growth by filling labor shortages in key industries. And here we're just looking at the variable about unionization, so those who are unionized and those who are not. And those who are more likely to agree with these statements about immigration, that it grows the workforce and supports economic growth.
Okay, we got into some detail about how different segments of the population there fit, but there's so much more we didn't have time to get into today. For more information, and Clement will talk about this, there's going to be a report on the Broadbent website with much more detailed information. We could literally talk about this for 4 hours, but we have a little bit of time so we can move on to the panel. Natalie and I will be around for most of the day to answer any questions if you spot us. On behalf of Viewpoints, I do want to thank the Broadbent Foundation and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Institute for their investment and their partnership. Clem and Jordan have been wonderful partners through this. We wouldn't want it for anybody else, and we want to thank you for your attention and your time today. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Good morning. Nice to see everyone here for a policy discussion, the first thing. And yes, like my colleagues at Viewpoints Research said, you can find our new report on the Broadbent Institute website, broadbentinstitute.ca/research. It's actually a really nice new website, in case you haven't noticed. And we present all of the findings that you saw today with really clean data visualizations, very interactive. You can isolate things. You can download that data as well for your own analysis. And so to start, from these findings, there is a clear shift happening in immigration attitudes, and from what we can also see from these trends in the new report, Shifting Borders, that sentiments of approval for immigration were growing for decades. We celebrated Canada's diversity and saw the economic value of immigration, and this was unique among other Western countries with immigration. You can see it in Table 1 of this report, where Canada's trends in alignment with countries like Germany, the United States, and UK are higher in approval for immigration. But we also see in Table 3, Chart 3 in the introduction, this decline kind of start just a few years ago. Why, in your view, are we seeing these new trends? And I'll start with Gowrie.
Thank you very much. Oh, you were right. He said you won't have to touch a button. Good morning, everyone. A big thank you to the Progress Summit for inviting the Canadian Council for Refugees to be with you all this morning. I've been really inspired by many of you over the last couple of days. Yeah, the data is super interesting. Thanks for doing that. So why are we seeing these new trends? Definitely true that Canadian opinion is changing with respect to immigration. My main comment is that that outcome relates to the fact that Canadians have been relentlessly fed messaging over the last couple of years that immigration in recent years is the cause of significant crises that have actually been decades in the making. So it has been a very effective narrative, but it actually is kind of bogus arguments. I think the important thing to underscore in that is that the crises themselves are real. We have a real housing crisis. We have a real absence of access to decent work. We are seeing real crises in access to healthcare. But even if you look just at the housing crisis, housing experts will tell you that there is no meaningful correlation between increases in immigration and the skyrocketing, like 300% increases in house prices. Migrants, refugees, and international students have been particularly scapegoated because they have the most precarious status. They were the easiest cause of the fake cause of the crisis to throw under the bus. And they are those at the margins of our society who are experiencing the housing crisis. They are not causing it. The impact of their presence in Canada has nothing to do with the levers of policy that actually affect whether rent control happens or doesn't happen, how we do or don't invest in social housing, or how housing is financialized. So we have a significant impact with Canadians being explained who has caused these crises, and we are seeing as a result some of these attitudes change. But I thought what was so important in the study was that is the system broken? There's been no fundamental shifts. Canadians are still largely quite positive on immigration. And what really has happened is there's been a failure in our ability to actually provide an alternative explanation for what is happening to these crises, to meet people where they're at and give them an answer, to expose the real villains who are accountable, those really with power who are accountable for the cause of these crises. And we haven't been able to engage them with an alternative narrative to explain that and to then continue to build from a values-based way on their ongoing support for immigration. And I can get into that a bit later.
And Pablo, I mean, we've also spoken about immigration as an issue last fall in the Perspectives Journal podcast. Your views on things like the temporary foreign worker program, and you also see in Table 2 in the introduction, the explosion in the past 10 years of that immigration pathway. It's not really immigration, it's a temporary foreign worker program. The explosion in population of that particular sector, maybe, in your view, is that a contribution to some of the trends we're seeing in perceptions to immigration?
Thanks, Clement. I think it's a great question. First, I want to say thank you to the Broadbent Institute, first of all, for commissioning the report and the research on this important topic. I would say that I think when we talk about Canada's immigration legacy, it's important to ground it in its reality, which is that Canada has always had a colonial, prejudiced, racist approach to immigration, one that privileged certain people from certain places and one that underprivileges others, and usually that's based on gendered, racialized categorization of who should be able to stay and who shouldn't, right? I think when we think about the temporary foreign worker programs, those were programs that were created decades ago under this guise of being temporary programs, but they've been permanent staples of Canada's history and legacy. And so when I think about today's moment and how we scapegoat or how we point to immigrants, migrants, people that may be under or undocumented, I feel like it only continues the legacy of this, like who should be able to stay, who has access to status, who should be able to participate fully in our economy, in our communities versus those that shouldn't. I guess what has changed is today we're connected in a way that perhaps we haven't been in the past with social media, with media and whatnot, and so it's easy to bombard us with these messages. But I think it's important to call it out for what it is, right? We've created these programs that, have preferred to bring in cheap, vulnerable, precarious, expendable labor, and preferred that model. We've also given the immigration system, in many ways, we've handed over the reins to employers, to industry, to people that are profit-driven, and so it's not a surprise to think that whether it's international students, whether it's temporary foreign workers, that these numbers of people that come in have skyrocketed because employers are seeing them as a means to bring in that labor, right? And so I always like to point to 2009 as a very interesting moment in our history. It was the first year ever that the number of people that entered Canada temporarily surpassed the number of people that could actually stay. And so it's kind of like the line in the sand type moment. But the reality is our programs that bring in cheap, vulnerable, expendable labor has been a reality for the last 200 years, if not beyond that in Canada. And so today, what's happening is that there's this rhetoric of people that primarily can't access social services as being the drain on our social services, when really the reality is that they're contributing the most and actually being legislated out of ever being able to receive that benefit. When it comes to the housing crisis, folks that are generally having the hardest time accessing housing are the ones that are being scapegoated as if they're the ones creating this crisis. And so it's important to say like that actually continues a legacy of scapegoating, of xenophobia, of saying who should or shouldn't be part of our society. I think that on top of that, I think that there's a conversation that's often missing when we think about legislative changes that affect so many people. So there was a change that affected almost 775,000 people that didn't have full status, and so people that were either waiting for status, were waiting to receive permanent residency, people that were temporary foreign workers that had access to pathways to status, and the government just pulled the rug from underneath them, right? And so the conversation that's often missing is this conversation on the real impact on people when we have legislative changes around immigration, how it displaces people. Our immigration system also depends on like the vulnerability of the push and pull factors that sometimes we create in other countries. So I always love to start where I'm from. I was born in Guatemala, and the Canadian mining corporations have a legacy of extractionism in these places. So they're displacing violently and criminally many communities, many indigenous communities, and then also coming in and saying, well, as a result of that, we can bring you to Canada under temporary foreign worker programs, bring you here. So we're not only extracting resources, but we're extracting you from your native land, coming to Canada to do work under this regime that is often very, creates vulnerability, precarity, that's very exploitative. And then we're gonna further scapegoat you and treat you as the problem or the issue whenever there's issues politically. And so, unfortunately, at this moment that we're living this incredibly precarious or I guess interesting time or different time politically, the scapegoat has been immigrants, has been migrant workers, has been folks that actually should be supported. People that need access to services are the ones that actually be pointing to and being displaced. And so I think it's important as people living in Canada that we recognize that while we can point to politicians in the US and we can say that they have this legacy of deportation and this legacy of strengthening their borders and how they police migrants or immigrants, I think it's important to say like we actually have that same legacy here in Canada, and when it's convenient we celebrate it, and when it's not we denounce folks that are under status or don't have status.
Thank you for that. And Matthias, coming from Germany, I know in Germany we're seeing the rise of the Alternative für Deutschland. Just the other day I saw the polls, this far-right anti-immigrant party rose above the Christian Democrats after the February federal election. Could you speak to maybe why that trend is happening? And is this something, you've only been in Canada for like a few days. It's too cold for Matthias, apparently. But have you seen, despite the weather, these parallels in Canada? Maybe that's something, it's what's happening in Germany. Is that Canada's future?
Well, hopefully not. Well, thank you for having me here and discuss this topic. I think that we should not mix it up too much. There is a debate on policy, on migration, on asylum seekers in Europe, which is an important part of the debate on migration. And on the other hand, we have a lot of factors contributing to the rise of the far right. Basically, cost of living crisis, insecurity, the war we face in the east of Europe, and all the insecurities this brings. But of course, the far right are exploiting anti-migrant sentiments, and they are, well, maybe they are successful in that also because our system of migration needs to be fixed, because it's really lacks consistency, and it is, to be honest, it's toxic to talk about migration in a moment in Germany, because on the one hand, everyone knows who's like clearly minded that we need more immigration in Germany. Germany is a relatively old country, so we will have a lot of labor force going out of the labor market in their pensions and so on. And they're like, according to statistics, probably one would need to have 400, 500,000 people every year come in net influx, in so to speak, just to have a stable workforce. So on the other hand, there's a discourse on that we have too many migrants in Germany, so which is not only far right, of course they are extremely pushing that, but it goes until like center parties, and it's also pushed very much from the center right, which will now have the chancellor again. And this has to do something with some kind of exceptional circumstances. There was, as you probably know, quite a substantial wave of refugees, asylum seekers from the Middle East, from Syria especially, and Iraq in 2015, 2016. And also it continued in a way because of the civil war in Syria. And then, of course, the war in Ukraine also led to a lot of people that had to flee their homes, and they moved to the European Union, to Poland and to Germany mainly. So there were, like, objectively many people seeking refuge in my country and in the European Union. And in some years it were up to 1 million people, which is, even with a country that works pretty well, it is substantial. On the other hand, we were really bad at integrating people into our society, because our general system on asylum seekers means if you are an asylum seeker, you're kind of put on hold. Yeah, you have to wait until your file is decided upon. So you can't work, you can't move to where you want to, you have to stay in like kind of shelters, and you can't integrate into society. And this, of course, also contributes that it's very, very difficult for newcomers to like do their way into society, to contribute, to make all these things that as a newcomer you actually want to. So they are excluded, and then everyone complains about them not being included. And on the other hand, we had a reform on like skilled labor immigration, which actually changed our system more in a direction from the Canadian system. We had a discourse, also a debate on how the Canadian system, it's so interesting. This came more from the right, to be honest, than from the left, because they discussed it in a way that we kind of replace refugees with like skilled migrants in the way the Canadians do, which of course it's very, very strange thing to do, and of course completely ignores the difference between our countries. So in the moment, we've been progressing on migration policy, like policy-wise, but the debate is very toxic.
Now, to Gary's point, because you mentioned refugees, and when I was studying at our alma mater, the Hertie School, back in 2015, that was the topic, this Flüchtlingspolitik and the Willkommenskultur. It's like, it was dominating German news and just the conversations I was even having among my classmates. But, Gary, as you do work on refugee policy, is there, a certain view, maybe, Canada has this history of welcoming refugees as well, but you also saw in the statistics, refugees have been deprioritized. Is that a cause for concern?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. We are seeing, and just kind of building on Pablo's point, we have actually a sort of an important thing that we can build on as movements, which is a high in principle regard or thought that Canada is a refugee leader. But what I was thinking about when you were speaking, Matthias, is really how difficult it is to ever compare what is happening in Germany or so many other countries in the world to what is happening in Canada, because we just have fundamentally different geopolitical context. Canada is bordered by 3 sides on oceans. We actually receive a tiny drop of those who are seeking refuge and protection compared to so many other countries. Germany is a strong example, but when we think about countries in the south, I don't know actually how Canada attends international forum and holds its head up at all when it, in front of Turkey or Lebanon, Colombia. These are countries that have stepped up in a much more important way to address their international responsibilities with respect to a global phenomenon of forced displacement and violence, which we contribute to, both through our extractive industries and through our foreign policy in the context of causes of war and extreme poverty and inequality around the world. I guess one of the, there's a couple of key points I wanted to make. One is that this tendency that we have had in Canada to identify who can we blame for this. There is nothing new about the most recent, this most recent phenomenon that we're seeing with respect to refugee claimants. When we had people at the border that were barely kind of 40,000 coming through that Roxham Road, you had the Premier of Quebec in an emergency screaming about the incapacity of services in Quebec to absorb, to address, when in fact we're actually highly skilled in Canada at resettling refugees. We do a good job of providing support and settlement services to this very small number of refugees we resettle. But somehow when refugees arrive this way, we know exactly what to do. But when refugees arrive this way, we're completely, flummoxed. But it's really because it's just a political pawn. It's a way to not take accountability for a failure to invest in key resources. I think just coming back to the Broadbent study, when we think about kind of what do we do with this? Because in fact, we have a lot of policy solutions. We know what we need to do. The system, we have never had a fair and just inclusive immigration system. It has been marked by racism, by classism, and by a fairly meager, a lack of real leadership and generosity in many ways in terms of refugees. So there's a lot of key areas with respect to granting permanent residence pathways, ending closed work permits, and a whole concept of indentured labor that keep workers vulnerable. 100% we have to eliminate the Safe Third Country Agreement with the US and defend the right to asylum. We currently are, both the Prime Minister and leaders of political parties are seeing people fleeing unbelievable danger in a state of lawlessness in the US, where the right to asylum has been completely shut down, and saying it's appropriate to send them back to the US because it's a safe system. So we need to end the STCA entirely. And we have a lot of ideas about important ways to address the essential racism and marginalization that's created through the temporary foreign worker program. But what we need to do is to create the political space again for the reforms that we know are needed, and to find ways to, in fact, reopen immigration levels that are essential to Canada's future and thriving, because we are also not just an aging population, we are a shrinking population. And you can see there is that middle that flip-flops so easily from your study. So I have my notes here because I couldn't always remember the numbers, but this fascinating figure, 62% of Canadians think immigration enriches our culture and social diversity and serves our economy. Guess what number 62% also agree but diversity is a challenging issue. So you have a middle that is open to being moved. Like, they're looking for political leadership in a little bit, so which way do we need to go? How does immigration serve Canadian needs or not? And I think that the important thing that we need to think about is who do we mobilize and how do we connect with that mushy middle? And the data that shows how, for example, unionized workers have far more open attitudes towards immigration. I'm going to do a little ad pitch here because we're really keen for other sectors to join us, but the Canadian Council for Refugees with other partners, we are actually, because we have been concerned about our inability, let alone all other partners, to effectively present the alternative narrative that engages Canadians to pull that middle. We are working on a messaging campaign with Anat Shaker-Osorio. We're working with Ecos Research. We're to actually, in a data way, like testing through actually working on what messages will appeal to our base. The focus for us in a messaging campaign is to mobilize the base that we know is there to do it and let them, in decentralized way, meeting people where they're at, engage the middle, rather than dilute positions to sort of try and guess where the middle is and change what we actually know are the important reforms needed for immigration. There is an incredible, powerful conversation that we can have with Canadians from all different backgrounds. With, you know, someone was talking about that yesterday, like tailored to who you're talking to in the moment. But we do need to build our muscle better at thinking, not talking on the frame, not having the conversation our opponents want to have, because that middle, that 62% that goes this way or that way, when we have the conversation about, in the negative frame, refugees are not security threats, or, you know, migrants are not causing the housing crisis, we almost never can win convincing people to address those fears, because the right is always better at fomenting the fear than we are at assuaging it. So the key is for us to think about a positive frame that engages that middle that is actually quite open, and where we still have, because we're not yet Germany, have actually a fairly strong basis to rebuild kind of confidence in a strong and open immigration system, while to create the political space to then address the policies that are actually quite racist and closed and need a lot of work. So we have already some support. QP has signed on, CAUT has signed on, we have the churches that have signed on, some of the settlement sectors, but we know we are stronger together. We know that these issues are interconnected, and so we're really keen both for people to kind of join us within this commitment when the messaging, the sort of data will go in the field shortly, so this is like a post-election effort. Really keen to think about other sectors that are interested to join with CCR in a positive value-based campaign that can engage people from a hopeful frame about what we need to do to build that country that we want, to build the future that we want, and to do it not just through digital messaging, but actually through strong organizing as well. And not by diluting what our message is, but by addressing the base that we know is quite there and ready to activate. But it will take effort, because we have to, I think, stop fighting the opponent's battles and find a place of a much firmer footing to engage Canadians. The tiny example I want to give, if you give me one more second, because just an example of leadership that's possible, because I've been so discouraged by so much of the political messaging that's out there. But I don't know if you guys remember, we've had such a, let me finish that sentence. Remember when Manitoba welcomed Palestinian refugee children? So this was in a context where we had almost every leader speaking in a high security frame about the threats, and we're not so sure. It was, I mean, it still remains to this day an unacceptable a program to supposedly bring Palestinians to safety from Gaza that almost no one can have access to, because we still are explaining to Canadians, rather than the positive frame that we did with the Syrian campaign, or the 300,000 Ukrainians that we signaled, Canada, these people are fleeing persecution, it's time to step up. Canadians did it across the country. In the Palestinian context, the frame has been security, but Wab, the Premier of Manitoba, greets two Palestinian children, and he says to the people of Manitoba, "This is who we have always been. We have always been the people who stand up in times of conflict and famine to help the innocent. I want to plant the flag on the notion that our province and our country can be a beacon of human rights. He actually invoked Every Child Matters, and he said, let us set out 2 more places at our table at the Manitoba family. And not just Manitobans, but I know so many Canadians were like, oh, like, where's that? That's where I want to go. So we have work to do, but we can get there.
Thank you for also noting in the data that major inconsistency, because a version of this report had the word contradictions. In the title, we revised it, but no, that's very prevalent throughout. You'll find data points that don't quite make a lot of sense. There's these inconsistencies, but what I try to get at in this report is that I think there is this stated objective of immigration policy from the 1976 Immigration Act. That was complemented by the multiculturalism embedded in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so this complementarity, I think, is what lends us to, you see in the statistics, we have high respect still for multiculturalism despite immigration attitudes going that way. But that's where I, kind of make the inference that it's a matter of disagreement with immigration policy rather than immigrants themselves. But there's still clearly a problem. And Pablo, you work very much on the Temporary Foreign Workers Program. And again, in the report, you see it's exploded versus the regular economic stream of immigration that's been the prevalent intention. That was the intention of this act in creating the refugee stream, the family reunification stream, and the point system that we know today. But I also know from my own experience that I have many relatives who are stuck in this point system. I also know a lot of them in this precarious temporary foreign worker situation because it's sold as something of an immigration stream. But Pablo, I'd like to hear your thoughts on, is this a framework that can be fixed? Should it be, sometimes you hear in this summit, like the Temporary Foreign Workers Program should be abolished. What, in your view, should happen next?
I think there's a lot that should happen next, but I think we got to root whatever changes that happen from like a human rights perspective, and actually, I guess appreciate the fact that what I was saying earlier was that legislative changes have a real impact on people's lives, right? And so I think when we talk about regularization, which was a topic that Trudeau introduced, I guess in 2021, was talking about wanting to regularize over 500,000 people in Canada that are under-statused or undocumented, and then abandon that, right, given the political moment, and it wasn't, I guess, convenient to continue that conversation. But historically, changes to any programs or any type of immigration policies have happened without people's voices at the table. One of the examples we like to give at UFCW, we've been working on migrant worker issues for the last 30 plus years, and every single year the Mexican government gets together with the Canadian government to evaluate and renegotiate the seasonal agriculture workers program. Up until last year, there had never been the presence of a labor union or labor rights advocacy groups or workers themselves, and yet over the last just decade, you would have seen a litany of changes to these temporary foreign worker programs, including the seasonal agriculture worker program, that speak to how people access work, where they go to work, their working conditions, or the contracts that are tied to a single employer. And so yearly, these entities get together to decide how it is that we're going to change these programs or manipulate these programs in a way that's usually beneficial for industry or companies, but we do not invite, we do not analyze, or we do not care as a nation for the real impact these changes have on the people that are actually doing the work. A good example is the recent changes that were announced before Trudeau left office are going to reduce the number of temporary foreign workers in Canada, are going to change certain industries from 2-year contracts to 1-year contracts. And on its face, we can say, what's the difference, right? But the real impact is that every single one of those temporary foreign workers will have to now apply yearly, might have to seek out recruiters yearly. And for those that don't know, people that are in the global south and that are involved in these programs often take out mortgage-sized loans to be able to access these programs, mostly because they're being promised some type of pathway to citizenship or some ability to make money that they might not be able to make in their native countries, and yet they're being sold this bill of goods and arriving only to face what the UN rapporteur has recently defined as the circumstances that allow for or mirror indentured servitude, right? And so what has to change is we have to have a human rights approach. If we're talking about a multicultural, inclusive, diverse society that Canada loves to brand itself as, then those principles have to be enacted when we talk about the changes to our immigration system. We have to talk about how temporary foreign workers, the migrant worker programs, quite literally are created to create two tiers in our society, those that have access to staying and those that don't. And they've been treated permanently as a temporary source of labor, but they've been a staple of our society, literally picking, packaging, processing, serving the food that we eat, taking care of our loved ones, working in our hospitals, in our home care facilities, taking care of our children, and yet being told that you're good enough to work here, but you're just not good enough to stay. And so the policy has to change. It has to be one that if we're talking about a society that's inclusive or that celebrates multiculturalism, then racialized folks that traditionally have been unable to access status should be given access to status, right? Whether that's done through what we've been able to do, which is negotiate status or access to status through our collective bargaining agreements, and I think that's something that often isn't necessarily seen as a pathway to status, but what we've been able to do in many of our meatpacking facilities is negotiate with employers that if workers are here for 2 years and they've been working with you, they've been union members, they should have access to status and being able to stay. And so what I think yesterday was spoken on one of the panels is like, as unions, as progressives, we can definitely and should be pushing for progressive legislation. But in the interim, we need to be able to do whatever possible in our own spaces, in our own places, to grant people that access or to support folks that are precarious or vulnerable. And so there's different avenues in which we can do this, but certainly what has to change is this idea that employers and industry should dictate the amounts or the people that come in or are able to stay or not stay. I think that's highly problematic. I think we also have to shift this narrative of who merits to stay, because things like the point system were a way of hiding how we prefer who comes in, right? It wasn't necessarily to do away with our preferential treatment. It was to say that we want a certain type of person from a certain place that has certain English skills or whatever it might have been to fulfill these quote unquote supposed labor shortages. And a lot of the labor shortages traditionally have been created by industry, right? To say that we have these shortages, rather than pay good wages and provide good working conditions so that people want to work in these type of jobs, what we do is we allow industry to create shitty conditions where they underpay, where there's dangerous, deadly work to be done, and say, hey, nobody else wants to do it, so I guess we should go in and grab temporary foreign workers to fill these labor shortages, right? And so that narrative has to be changed, right? The problem is that we've granted way too much power to industry, and industry is dictating these realities. And so I think when we say what has to change, there's a whole litany of things that have to, right? One, we need to lessen the power that industry has to dictate these terms. Why do you have any real meaningful say on our immigration policy or who gets to enter the country? That's problematic. But we also need to center any changes around the actual voices, lived experiences, the realities that migrant workers are facing, right? And so when we see changes, like I think that Stephen Harper introduced this 4 years in, 4 year out program which displaced workers, and then they rebuked that and said we need another approach, and so we increased the amount, or the expedited how people could access temporary foreign workers by creating I think they called it the ELMO, the Expedited Labor Market Impact Assessments, so that employers could quickly access workers. And so you're like, these changes we make are about industry having access to people, but they're seldom made on a way that says, how do the human beings who are impacted by these policies, how do we expedite their access to rights, their access to residency, their access to dignity, right? And I think that framework has to be fundamentally shifted so that when we talk about any other changes, it's based and centered around people first.
Thank you for that. No. And Matthias, going a bit off script here, but I want to take us back to Germany. And in Berlin, you had something similar to a temporary foreign worker program. In a way, the Gastarbeiter program that brought a lot of people from places like Turkey to live in Germany to work. And in Kreuzberg, at Cottbusser, you have this public housing. You know, you can see it, it's very visible, it's very notable architecture, and that is all populated by German guest workers. But it's still populated by Turkish guest workers that came decades ago. They're not exactly guest workers anymore, they're there to stay. And you know, there's been this social exclusion, and then you also continue on with new refugee policy with every wave of refugee crises that hits Germany. And more recently then, in around 2015, you can see in Tempelhofer Feld, that's where Syrian refugees were housed around, you know, makeshift prefabricated homes. There's still a bit of a housing solution there to house the refugees, to house guest workers. And in Canada, we had, you know, at the Broadbent Institute's Progress Summit last year, a conversation about getting government back into the business of building housing. We wrote all of this about it, and Mark Hardy's saying this again and again today. But you know, all that to say, it seems like in Germany there has been this housing policy that also complemented newcomers and the waves that they came. Could you maybe speak to how, you know, that maybe even contributed to the welcoming culture that accompanied the Syrian refugee crisis? It was 1 million refugees, and Angela Merkel was praised for that. But you know, you're also housing 1 million people really, really fast. Is that maybe what you know, enabled some of that you know, welcoming culture, this social harmony in the first place, given that crisis?
Well, in the beginning of that so-called refugee crisis, or like in the summer of migration that others say in 2015, there was a very high, like a very positive sentiment in the population that they wanted to be helpful, they wanted to be welcoming, and that they wanted to make impossible things possible. In a broad spectrum of society, not only like among traditionally left and liberal people, but also within conservatives, and it was quite encouraging. And also this very famous statement of Angela Merkel, she said, we can make it, so wir schaffen das. There was something that reflected this state of mind, but it decreased, and it did so also because we did not, like, what is in English, we did not live up to our words. Yeah? We did not provide the public services that are necessary to support newcomers. We did not invest in housing. We did not invest in education as much as is needed. If you have so many new children coming, we did not invest enough also in like language programs and so on. We did invest, but not enough. And in terms of housing, it's the point is segregation, obviously, was what you mentioned, that it did not work to integrate newcomers into society properly. But I think we have to distinguish between what you mentioned, this Gastarbeiter schemes, which were in the west of Germany, which is also important to mention, in the 70s. I come from the east of Germany, like the former communist part, and there was a very, very restrictive, to put it mildly, migration policy only among the like Eastern Bloc countries. We had some like brother countries, and the migrant workers from there were strictly segregated from society in very cruel ways. So when women workers became pregnant, they were sent back, and those kind of really cruel things. And in West Germany, it was not that bad, but it still was very segregated approach. And it was all, the general idea was, okay, they come and they leave again. And and this was reflected in a lot of issues, from our segregated schooling system to housing. And there really needs to be a change on the general, like if you provide universal public services that are good, that are well functioning, in the right amount, then you, in the same time, also lived the level of society to deal with heterogeneity. Yeah? And this did not really happen as much as we wanted. And then what happened next is what you said also about the Canadian situation, was scapegoating. Yeah? It's yeah, okay, we have too many refugees, so my children can't have like physical education in school because the sports hall is needed to shelter refugees, so it's their fault. And so I have a hard time finding an appointment for the doctors because all the refugees go to the doctors, their fault. And then we had discussion about, should we exclude them from some public services? And to some point it happened. For example, there was a change from like minimum support schemes for refugees, that they are not in cash now anymore, but they only get like specific goods, yeah, that it can, or like with a kind of a credit card, they can buy specific goods in the supermarket, so it's completely discriminatory. So they cannot really decide on their own what they want to buy and so on, those kind of things. So I think a society that we shouldn't neglect the challenge that refugees in this kind of volume that do pose some challenges for societies, but a society that is well prepared, that has well-working universal public services and housing is much better prepared for those kind of challenges. And then you see also the upsides of newcomers much more easily and faster, and this changes also society's attitude towards it. So it is about the capacity, it is about public services.
Yes.
Well, I just want to jump on that because I'm listening. Again, the parallels are so not there. It's really so different. There is so much about the German experience with holding people in detention centers and segregated kind of housing that we would never want to replicate in Canada, but we have still never, ever been tested with any of these kinds of numbers. But we have actually, quite an incredible experience to build on. So we have a very racist past of how we've addressed migrant workers, but we actually have some very strong traditions of how we have integrated refugees. We have a private sponsorship refugee program where Canadians actually, and often it's family members, so people in Canada who are supporting and accompanying refugees in communities. And we know that community-based support is absolutely critical. So the struggle that we're having now is very much one of how do we ensure, in general, affordable, accessible housing for a whole range of low-income people in Canada, which would include newcomers and refugees, but many other populations. And we need to create that service in a kind of we need to create that housing in an integrated, universal way across our communities. And the particular needs that refugee claimants have when they arrive do need dedicated support. We have all the models that we know how to do it. We've done it very poorly in Canada, where we, instead of being ready, we are just constantly surprised, and we bus people around at last minute and we put them in hotels. Refugee claimants have very specific legal needs. They often have come out of traumatic experiences and they need support. But we know from the kind of solutions that have been born from communities and civil society organizations, we know how to do it in very cost-effective ways that are not about segregating people, either in large separated housing or detention centers or in hotels, but actually through reception centers located locally in communities that have a very short transition period for people to actually be connected to their work permit and be on their way to find housing. So then the struggles that they find are the ones that all other people face. How do we just, in general, increase the stock of affordable, available housing? But we are so far from the numbers that would challenge our ability to do that, and we have such a strong experience and community models that know how to do it. We actually, the only bright light recently from the last budget, we actually had dedicated $1.1 billion in investment in the federal budget for refugee claimant housing, and now the challenge is identifying communities and provinces that are willing to step up to build just reception centers so people are triaged, receive the legal aid support they need. We need investments in legal aid, and then find themselves in community and on their way, so they are not actually segregated. So again, I feel like there is a lot on the solution side. We kind of know what's needed. We know how to do it from a rights-based and dignity perspective, but we have to create the context that political leaders feel there's permission for that. And just listening to Pablo, I mean, who in listening to Pablo wouldn't just sign up for everything he's saying? So we need to either just, replicate Pablo a million times, or we need to train ourselves. We actually need to get support in the information and messaging that can connect with people to tap what we know is there, which is still generally, I think, people in Canada's ability and understanding to focus on, let's hold accountable those who are actually accountable for some of these problems, call for the policy change we need, and send the signal that we actually want to continue. We want to be welcoming societies, and facing some of the hard truths about the ways that we actually absolutely, haven't been. And so that training is what we're keen to get into. How do we not just develop kind of messaging frames to talk to people in real ways, but train ourselves to do it in a way that is right-centered and dignity-centered, so that brings people to where we want them to be, so we can get the kind of legislative reforms and fundamental structural reforms of the programs that are needed.
Thank you for that. And just one more question to Pablo, and then I'll ask a final question. But I want you to chime in on the situation with housing. Also, in our survey, we asked are immigrants, responsible for the healthcare crisis we're also facing. Maybe if you want to speak on, is immigration the cause or maybe the solution to the housing and healthcare issues Canadians everywhere are facing?
Yeah, I guess I'd say that definitely not the cause of, in any way, shape, or form of the crisis. Usually folks that are having difficulty accessing status or that come either as asylum seekers, as refugees, as temporary foreign workers, or international students, their data suggests that they're the ones having the most difficulty accessing these things. And so to suggest in any way, shape, or form that they may be contributing to the problems that exist, I'd go back to the previous answer, which was these are manufactured crises, right? So when we talk about the crisis in healthcare, really these are manufactured crises. If we look at Ontario, what we have is a government that chooses to underfund these services and then use the underfunding, the crisis that is created by underfunding these services as a reason for which we need to look at private healthcare as a solution, right? And that's just manufactured so that the solution can be this profit-driven entities rather than continuing to fund socially universal programs that are meant to service everybody, right? And so what we have is this idea that folks that have a difficulty accessing these services as the problem as to why these services aren't necessarily well funded, which is a ridiculous notion. One of the examples we like to give often at the UFCW is when we look at a lot of the immigration schemes, especially as they relate to temporary foreign workers, there are legislative differences with the treatment of temporary foreign workers versus anybody else. So what we say is, what we say is that they're racist practices, right? When you say you're a temporary foreign worker and you have to contribute to the employment insurance scheme, but you are legislated out of ever receiving unemployment, right? What you're saying is you have to pay into the system that all other Canadians may depend on, but you will never be allowed to access that benefit that is provided primarily through that system. That is to say that we will extract further from you, but not allow you to participate as if you were a person working in this country. That's highly problematic, and it's not the only place we do it, right? If you look at Ontario, you look at Alberta, you look at different provinces that have actually legislated temporary foreign workers in the agricultural sector from accessing health and safety legislation. So what we're saying is a basic protection, which just says that you're able to know that there are issues that might put you at vulnerability at your work, or the ability to participate or the ability to refuse unsafe work has been taken away from migrant workers that are often doing some of the most deadly and dangerous work. How I would tie that to the issue is that we have a legacy of actually creating systems that don't allow folks to access or participate in them, and then we're blaming them that have no access to these systems as the issue as to why other people are having problems either accessing or experiencing what they're experiencing within these systems. And so when we talk about the solution, yeah, absolutely, the solution is granting folks access to status or pathways to citizenship. It's about ensuring that people that come in that have access to work are actually given access to stay so that they can contribute and continue working in the places that we do need workers, right? I think one of the interesting statistics that we have or models that we've been able to show is that in some of our meatpacking plants where we've been able to get people access to status, those folks, contrary to what industry would tell you, when people stay, they'll leave, and that's why we don't want to give them permanent residency status. It's actually been the opposite experience. In our meatpacking plants where people access status because they're union or their employer, they're more likely to stay, they're more likely to want to bring other people to work in these places. And so we know that we have certain gaps where labor shortages do exist. We know that there are workers willing to do that work. But as long as we treat those workers as vulnerable, precarious, and unable to access full status, we're the ones doing this disservice to ourselves. And so not only are folks that are under status and undocumented or underdocumented not contributing to the issue, they are and possibly do possess the ability to fix some of these issues. But I would say that industry, government has no interest in actually fixing the root causes. In fact, industry who benefits the most from these type of programs or these type of immigration schemes are driving governments to actually displace workers, to keep people vulnerable. And I don't think we have to point any further than the abandoning of this conversation around regularization, which really illustrates that at one point it was politically convenient for the Liberals to talk about regularizing folks that were underdocumented or undocumented. And then because it's convenient or because the political moment was such that we had to alienate ourselves from that discourse, the Liberals abandoned that conversation completely, right? And that is to say that rather than being true to what Canada would like to present itself as this inclusive society, we're quite the opposite, right? And the people that are actually, at the end of the day, suffer the most are migrants, are people that are underdocumented, undocumented. And then the scapegoating of those folks is not to be so repetitive, but goes back to like our history and our legacy of being, this colonial country that has ripped land away from indigenous folks to this land, who claim that this country is theirs, then displace indigenous and racialized people from other bodies, bring them here, further exploit them, negate their ability to actually participate fully in our society, and then use them as a reason that our social services are eroding, when the reality is industry has been granted way too much power. The Conservatives have been happy to comply, and more recently, Liberals at a federal level have done the same.
We have 10 minutes left. We could talk about this probably for all day, forever. But for Matthias first, you just came off of 2 elections. Your own election in the European elections last year, and this federal one in February. Immigration was a hot topic, and there was this rise of the far right. Could you tell us if we're going through a federal election here in Canada as we speak? Are there any lessons you'd like to share with Canadians on how to deal or talk about immigration policy?
Well, if you consider immigration in a nexus with security and with crime, this is what we've been talking about in Germany constantly, it will always favor the far right. It will always favor the far right because they kind of do own the issue, yeah? I always constantly see, not only in my country, but also in other European countries, center-right parties and actors to kind of take over this discourse and debate, because they think when we are the actors of this debate, and we will get the votes, and the far right will shrink in their support. It never happens. It never happens. If you have this kind of toxic debate about migration and crime, then you always favor the far right. So never do it. I think that you're not likely to do it, but it will. Sometimes you can't escape a national debate on it. So I mean, it's maybe known that we had several very cruel and also terrorist attacks in the run-up to the elections that were committed by people that some way or the other came through a refugee status to Germany. So it was a very, very unfortunate debate we had, because it was not possible to talk soberly on the issue anymore. So you should never enter into this. I mean, that's obvious. It's obvious. I mean, problems exist, but problems can be solved, and you always need to talk about these issues in a general way about what kind of society we want to be, what kind of services our society wants to deliver to its citizens, how can our citizens, how can everyone who lives in the country contribute to this society. This is the way it's supposed to be put forward. So never touch on these issues in the way that we did. This is the most simple idea that I could give. And just once you start to scapegoat, once you start to make people responsible for problems that they cannot solve, then it's very difficult to find a way out of it, because the far right will always fuel these sentiments. They will always find something else that migrants are allegedly responsible for, and so you can really not escape this discourse. It's very important to discuss policies on migration as part of a wider idea of how a good society should look like, and then also put resources into it and put political commitment into it. This is the best way you go forward.
And to the Canadians on the panel, we are in the midst of a federal election. I'll go with Paulo first. How should we be speaking about immigration if we take Matthias's advice, maybe at all? What's your take on immigration in the election today?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that immigration shouldn't be seen as this political hot potato, right? I think we either have a mandate, a vision of what we want to build as a reality for how we treat migrants or immigrants in Canada, or we don't, right? Like it's just this need or ability to change winds or conversation or discourse depending on the political moment that we're seeing or living is the problem, right? We either have an approach that is holistic, that treats people with respect and dignity, that invites people in, or we don't. There is no middle ground. And I think that the conversation has to be around either holding the people that speak to this issue to some level of account on their actions. We need to focus and center the lived experiences, the displacement of people. When the new legislations or the new changes to migration happened, we literally affected 775,000 people that were impacted by this legislation. It was almost as if it didn't impact anybody, right? This discourse as if they're words on a piece of paper, but they don't have human impact. And so what I'd say is we need to either hold our politicians to account, or, I mean, we've always said it, and I think this space is always conducive to it, is that we have to find a way that we seek that power, how we're able to implement or create pathways to citizenship, how we're able to do something, the work that we do to ensure that services are available, that they're accessible, that they're real and tangible for the folks that need it. Because otherwise, we have manufactured ways of keeping people precarious, vulnerable, and at the outskirts of our society, and it's highly problematic. I guess I should have started today's conversation by saying I actually came to Canada as a refugee in the late 80s, and the experience of so many of us are that we end up being marginalized, that our families end up being precarious, end up having to labor in spaces and places that are dangerous, that don't allow us to access real, meaningful participation in society. And so we either have an approach as a country or we don't. And so this middling ground, or this ability to kind of seesaw depending on the political winds, is problematic. And so I think we actually have to hold politicians to an account in terms of like, what is the approach? What is our real identity as an immigration system in Canada, right? And if it's not that we're multicultural and it's not that we're inviting, then what is it, right? And let's call it what it is. And so I think we need to define who it is that we are as Canada when it comes to immigration, and actually keep anybody and everybody to that standard.
Gary, last words to you.
We do have to define it, and your experience is, yeah, very real, and it's something we have to recognize. I think we do have to define what we want it to be, because the politicians are always bad at it, and they vacillate with, oh, what's winnable tomorrow, what's winnable right now. In the election we're in right now, somewhat gratefully, the potential for immigration to be a very frontline issue did go down, because it has become about Trump and the tariffs. And in that context, there is actually some opening as we see people across Canada, including refugees and migrant communities that we work with, rallying to define who actually are we and who aren't we. There is an important promise there about testing this question: do we want to be a nation that actually upholds human rights and dignities? Do we want to be a nation that brings indentured labor to work in essentially modern-day slave-like conditions in absolutely unacceptable housing? Or do we want to be a society that welcomes people to live in dignity and contribute in all of the ways? Underneath the study that you had is a strong sense that there are really important contributions that immigration makes, but there's nothing linear or naturally progressive about the way Canada will evolve. And so, as much as I'm embittered by the experience, I feel like it's incumbent upon us internally. We need to talk a lot about how shitty it is, but we actually have to project a hopeful message about the communities and the country we could be. And it's not a long list of policy recommendations. So our experience has been, and I have to say that all these policy kind of wonks on the panel. Anant Shekhar is talking to us a lot of times about selling the brownie, the back of the box, and in your conversations with your policy platform people and your leaders, you have to explain, you have to add an egg, turn it to 350, 1 cup of flour. That's not what's interesting, how you get to the brownie. You've got to sell the brownie on the box. So we have to think about what's the vision, the compassionate vision, things like, if we're good enough to work here, we are good enough to live here. People can rally behind messages like that. Do we want to be a country that welcomes people, that offers safety? If your family was fleeing safety, how do we want to be treated by our neighbors? These are the kind of hope-based, values-based messages that if we can mobilize our base to connect with that mushy middle that vacillates all the time, that is how I think we will create space. It will not be easy. That is the work of activism, and that is what we look forward to finding ways to work on with all of you. Thank you.
Gary, Pablo, Matthias, thank you, vielen Dank, for this amazing panel. Give it up for the panelists. Yes. So we now have a 15-minute coffee break. You'll find coffee in the lobby. And then up next on this stage, we'll have leader of Canada's NDP, Jagmeet Singh.